Cotton was the most money-making crop, what I can remember when I was a kid. That's where most of the money was, because cotton was, the crop at that time. But the rest of the things that we raised, corn was usually for making feed, making meal. Then you'd raise, sugar cane for making the sorghum molasses. Hay was, of course, feed for the cattle. And then, of course, we'd raise chickens and we'd feed the corn to the chickens. And so it was kind of a all-encompassing process. And the term sharecropping was the fact that of all of these things you were doing to live and try to make a little money, you shared in that. Some people owned the land, some people provided the labor and the expertise to raise the crops. So it was kind of like a communal type operation back before communals were popular. Because Dad had a reputation of being such a good farmer, people would basically get him to raise crops on their property for a percentage of the yield that came out of the crops every year. And we raised everything. We raised cotton, corn, hay. We'd get out and get the soil started, and by May you had to have your crops in the field for the growing season to hit your harvest threshold too. So they had 2 hoppers on each row. One was for fertilizer and one was for seed. So the tractor would go down through there, and once you got the soil prepared, you'd go down through there and it'd put down fertilizer and plant the seeds. And one of the earliest remembrances I have is I probably didn't weigh 110 pounds, and we would carry 100-pound sacks of fertilizer, and I'd literally have to drag them out because Daddy was on the tractor, and when he got to the end of the row, you had to fill it up with fertilizer and fill it up with seeds, and he didn't want to have to wait on you. You had to be sitting there ready, dump it in there real quick, and he'd take off again. They would plant it contiguous. Then you'd go in and what they call chopping cotton, you'd chop out, segments so that it could grow. You wouldn't have so much in a concentrated area because it would eat up all of the food source for the cotton. At the same time, you were thinning the cotton out so it'd grow properly. You'd also make sure you got the grass out of it, because the grass would be eating up all the nutrients too. Basically try to keep the boll weevils out of the crops.
Well, the first town saw boll weevil, he was sitting on a cotton square. This town saw boll weevil, killed whole family there. What the ring he said, about to kill me dead.
Yeah, I remember one year, everybody just about lost their cotton because there was a epidemic of boll weevils during that year, and Daddy was one of the few that was able to make a return off of the crops that year because he was that good. And of course, everybody was volatile to the rain. I remember Daddy was saying that it either rained too early or too late. Of course, if it rained too early, you couldn't get in the fields to plant the crops. And if it rained too late, the crops wouldn't come up properly because they didn't get the right moisture. So, yeah, Daddy would stand on the front porch a lot of days, and you could just look at his face and he'd be stressing out. And so, yeah, I'd say probably one of the most stressful jobs you would ever have is raising crops the way that they were raised back in those days. But I know they didn't have written sharecrop agreements because they'd just basically say, well, I'll tell you what, if you'll farm that 80 acres back there in the bottom, we'll do it on, I remember they used to talk about quarters. So if you'll farm it for me, we'll pay all the expenses and you get a quarter of the proceeds. And no, they never signed anything. I know we'd have some years that we wouldn't necessarily lose the crops, but you wouldn't make the yield that you had hoped. So therefore, if you don't make the yield, then of course you're not going to make as much money. And Daddy would pay the bank what he could on what he had borrowed, and the banks, you know, they knew the farming business, and they'd say, well, we'll just hope next year we do better. So you'd carry that debt over to the next year. You know, we grew up poor, but we never went without food and always had clothes to wear. So Daddy would, you know, he was pretty resilient in that respect. You worried about making money second. First thing you had to do was feed everybody. Mom would process tons and tons, it seemed like, of tomatoes and butter beans and peas. We would process them, she would can them, and then they would give those out to the other families that were part of the sharecropping operation. And that was their food too. It was kind of a several family process. They would share in killing the hogs or the cattle and processing those and all that goes along with that. And they would share in, they'd all split up, you know, the food. It was a big event. It just went on for days and days and days.